Music. It was a sentence that reverberated like thunder through the silent corridors of power, changing everything. Behind the walls of the British establishment, a plan was apparently forming that could financially cripple Prince Harry. While the public believed for years that the rift between Prince William and Prince Harry was primarily emotional, everything now indicates that the real war is being fought on a different front, in the shadow of estate management, wills, and old agreements. What initially appeared to be a family dispute is increasingly revealing itself as a battle for control, loyalty, and millions. At the heart of the escalation is an inheritance that was considered secure. Prince Harry had relied on the fact that his mother Princess Diana's estate, particularly the Spencer fortune, was beyond any royal influence. This assumption now appears to be faltering. According to information from palace circles, Prince William has begun exerting massive pressure behind the scenes to block, or at least delay his brother's access to precisely this fortune. The accusation is pragmatic. Prince Harry, through his public actions and business activities, is alleged to have violated the moral foundations of the inheritance. The conflict marks a new level of intensity. For years, interviews, books, and television appearances were the focus. Now, legal constructs and historical documents are taking center stage. In particular, an unassuming document from 1993 has suddenly gained enormous significance. It is said to be a document written by Princess Diana, intended to guide the management of her fortune. What was long considered a mere wish list is now apparently being interpreted as a moral compass with potentially far-reaching consequences for Prince Harry. Prince William is reportedly arguing that his mother's fortune was never meant to finance attacks on the institution she herself helped shape. In this interpretation, the inheritance is understood not only as financial support but also as an obligation to the family name. This is precisely the crux of the escalation. From the Prince of Wales's perspective, Prince Harry has been crossing this line for years. Media projects, legal battles, and public criticism were reportedly financed directly with funds intended to preserve the family legacy. The international context further heightens the tension. Prince Harry lives with Meghan Markle in California, a U.S. state with strict regulations regarding joint ownership. This very fact is said to be causing Prince William considerable anxiety. His fear is that once the assets are transferred from Great Britain to the U.S. and become intertwined with joint finances, legal disputes could take a completely different course than intended. What was meant to protect the next generation could be redistributed in foreign courts. This prospect fundamentally alters the dynamics. The conflict is no longer merely an internal family matter but touches upon issues of international law, asset protection, and long-term control over Princess Diana's estate. Prince William is said to be determined to minimize this risk at all costs. His motivation is less about personal gain than the fear of an irrevocable loss of control over a historically and emotionally charged fortune. For Prince Harry, this development represents an existential threat. The financial security he had relied on is now faltering. At the same time, the impression is growing that his break with the family could also have material consequences. The escalation follows a clear logic. Whoever breaks away from the institution may also lose their claim to its protective mechanisms. Thus, more than just money is at stake. It's about the power to interpret Princess Diana's legacy, about loyalty within the family, and about the extent of the future king's power. Is this step a necessary safeguard of the family heritage or a calculated blow against the renegade brother? And above all, how far will this conflict escalate before one side gives in? The deeper one delves into the background of this conflict, the clearer it becomes that this is not a spontaneous reaction, but a strategically prepared escalation. At its heart is a document that lay unnoticed in archives for decades and has now suddenly become the key element in a bitter power struggle. The so-called written will from 1993, authored by Princess Diana, is evolving into a legal and moral weapon in the hands of Prince William. What was once considered a mother's personal hope is now being interpreted as a measure of loyalty. According to internal sources, Prince William has instructed his legal advisors to reassess this document. The central argument is that Princess Diana intended her fortune not only to provide financial security for her sons, but also to ensure that her name and legacy would be protected. This is precisely where the accusation comes in. Prince Harry's media offensive against the royal family is seen as a fundamental breach of this tacit expectation. The inheritance thus no longer appears as an unconditional right, but as a privilege with implicit limitations. This reassessment dramatically alters the legal landscape, as aristocratic estates often operate under different rules than ordinary inheritances. Trustees have discretionary powers that, in extreme cases, can be used to postpone payouts or make them conditional. This is precisely where the strategy comes into play. Prince William is expected to argue that Prince Harry's behavior has placed him in a precarious position, making the immediate release of the fortune irresponsible. The connection between moral obligation and legal implementation is particularly delicate. While critics might see this as an emotionally motivated show of force, Prince William's inner circle emphasizes the preventative nature of the action. The concern lies less in the immediate handling of the money than in its long-term consequences. The idea that parts of Princess Diana's legacy could be exploited in commercial ventures or ensnared in international legal battles is deeply troubling. At the same time, the pressure is mounting on those responsible for managing the fortune. They are caught between familial obligation and institutional loyalty. Every decision becomes a political act. Releasing the fortune could be interpreted as supporting an attack on the monarchy. Conversely, blocking it would portray Prince Harry as a victim and further polarize public opinion. This very dilemma is what makes the situation so explosive. Added to this is the symbolic dimension. Princess Diana's fortune is not merely a financial asset, but an emotionally charged symbol. It represents independence, protection, and a mother's promise to her children. If this promise is now reinterpreted, the public perception of the entire family will shift. Prince William risks appearing as a ruthless power politician, while Prince Harry could portray himself as a disenfranchised son. However, from the future king's perspective, another consideration seems to prevail. Control over how the legacy is used, who benefits from it, and in what context the name Princess Diana appears in the future. According to this logic, freezing or diverting the inheritance is not an act of cruelty, but a protective mechanism, an attempt to safeguard history from commercial exploitation. This shifts the conflict definitively from the emotional sphere to the arena of cold calculation. What began as a familial rift is evolving into a high-stakes legal chess game. The crucial question remains: will this strategy actually work, or will it merely ignite an even greater public backlash? And how long can an inheritance that has long since become a global symbol be controlled? With each new detail, the impression grows that the conflict has long since taken on an international dimension. The focus is increasingly shifting away from British archives and over to the American West Coast. According to several observers, this is precisely where the real heart of the escalation lies. Prince Harry's primary residence in California is considered the central risk driving Prince William to his drastic actions. Not personal resentment, but legal alarm seems to be the engine of this development. California is known for its strict regulations regarding joint assets. In this legal system, even funds clearly declared as inheritance can lose their special status as soon as they are commingled with joint accounts or investments. This so-called commingling of assets is described by Prince William's inner circle as a nightmare scenario. The idea that parts of Princess Diana's legacy could be reassessed or even divided in a distant courtroom is apparently causing extreme anxiety. For the Prince of Wales, this isn't about hypothetical scenarios, but about concrete worst-case scenarios. Should legal disputes arise in the future, assets originally intended for the direct bloodline could fall into the wrong hands. Particularly sensitive are not only sums of money, but also sentimental value such as jewelry, documents, or personal mementos belonging to Princess Diana. In the worst-case scenario, these could be considered part of an asset pool that is redistributed. This fear lends a new rationality to Prince William's actions. From this perspective, freezing or diverting the inheritance appears not as an act of revenge, but as a protective barrier, a safeguard against a legal system beyond the control of the British family. The strategy follows a clear objective: to keep the assets in the United Kingdom and under British control for as long as possible. Any transfer across the Atlantic is considered a potential risk. For Prince Harry, this development represents a significant restriction of his financial freedom. His confidence that his mother's legacy is unassailable is shaken. At the same time, the pressure mounts as ongoing costs, security expenses, and legal proceedings continue. The freezing of expected funds exacerbates the dependence on commercial success and external sources of income. The escalation is acting like a domino effect. The greater the concern on Prince William's side, the harsher the measures. And the more drastic these measures become, the greater the public pressure. Critics are already speaking of a power struggle that extends far beyond the private sphere. Supporters, on the other hand, see the approach as a necessary step to protect a historic legacy from uncontrollable developments. At the same time, uncertainty is growing about how long this strategy can be sustained. A frozen fortune generates not only legal but also media tensions. Every new revelation, every speculation further fuels the debate. Prince William risks being perceived as the architect of a financial blockade that systematically puts his brother under pressure. Prince Harry, meanwhile, faces the question of how far he can go to counter this pressure publicly or legally. The conflict is thus reaching a new level of escalation. It is no longer just about familial loyalty or moral obligations, but about the collision of two legal systems and two worlds. Can a British legacy be permanently protected from American access? Or is this blockade merely a postponement that will further exacerbate the conflict? These are precisely the questions driving developments and leaving open the question of whether this power struggle is even controllable anymore. As the conflict intensifies internationally, a place that has so far been considered a quiet symbol of remembrance, Althorp, is moving into the spotlight. The Spencer family estate is increasingly becoming the focal point of a loyalty conflict that seems almost impossible to resolve. Here, far from the public eye, the interests of the crown, the family, and the legacy are converging. At the center is Earl Spencer, who suddenly finds himself in the role of arbiter, making decisions whose consequences extend far beyond the family. For decades, Earl Spencer has been considered the guardian of Princess Diana's memory. His position confers moral authority, but also enormous responsibility. It is precisely this responsibility that now makes him a key figure in a dispute that is increasingly being interpreted in political terms. What began as a family vote is evolving into a question of loyalty to the future power center of the monarchy. The expectation is clearly stability, protection of the legacy, and unity. According to unanimous assessments, the pressure on Althorp is mounting considerably. The Spencer family's asset management firm traditionally operates with discretionary powers that can be exercised in exceptional circumstances. These powers are now under scrutiny. A delay or restriction of the payment to Prince Harry could be formally justified as a protective measure. At the same time, it would send a clear signal that could hardly be misinterpreted. The dilemma is obvious. Releasing the funds would be seen as a rejection of Prince William, who bases his argument on protecting the legacy. A blockade, on the other hand, could be perceived by Prince Harry as a final break with his own family. The decision is not only financial but also deeply symbolic. It touches upon the question of whose interpretation of Princess Diana's legacy carries weight. The situation is further complicated by the fact that every action or inaction is publicly interpreted. Althorp is under scrutiny. The perception of whether one is seen as a neutral administrator or a partisan actor can have long-term consequences. One wrong move could draw the Spencer family into a conflict that, until now, has been considered primarily an internal royal matter. Added to this is the political dimension. Prince William embodies the future of the monarchy. His expectations are not only interpreted as personal desires, but also as an expression of institutional stability. Earl Spencer thus finds himself under subtle but effective pressure. The message is clear. Decisions in favor of Prince Harry could be interpreted as supporting an opposing position that the future king perceives as a threat. At the same time, Earl Spencer faces the moral imperative to preserve his sister's legacy regardless of political considerations. Princess Diana had always emphasized how important the freedom and well-being of her sons were to her. This memory now clashes with the reality of an escalating power struggle. The legacy becomes a projection screen for conflicting interests. In this constellation, every decision loses its innocence. Hesitation can be just as consequential as a clear commitment. Al Dorb thus becomes the silent battleground of a conflict that officially doesn't exist, but in fact touches the very core of the family. The question is no longer whether a decision will be made, but when and at what cost. The longer the uncertainty persists, the greater the risk of a public escalation. The expectation that Al Dorb will bring about a solution is growing. But can a single actor even bear this pressure? Or will this question of loyalty ultimately damage the legacy itself? As the lines of conflict harden, the scenario that could hit Prince Harry most hard is taking shape, a financial construct that effectively disenfranchises him without formally depriving him of anything. In wealth management circles, this model is referred to as a protective measure. Critics call it a financial straitjacket. The core of this strategy lies in the possibility of formally allocating the inheritance while simultaneously restricting its direct control. For Prince Harry, this would be a historic turning point. At its heart is the idea of a so-called protective or blocking arrangement. The assets would not be paid out but would remain in a controlled structure within the United Kingdom. Prince Harry would still be considered a beneficiary but would not have direct access to the capital. This solution is presented as a compromise intended to preserve Princess Diana's legacy while avoiding the risks of a full payout. This is precisely where its controversy lies. From Prince William's perspective, this model offers several advantages. It prevents the transfer of the assets to another legal system, thus shielding them from potential legal challenges. At the same time, it allows the measure to be portrayed as a responsible act. The focus is on protecting the substance, not on personal enrichment. This argument aims to diffuse criticism and replace the impression of harshness with an appearance of benevolence. For Prince Harry, however, this scenario represents a massive loss of control. The financial independence he associated with the inheritance would become an illusion. Instead, a relationship of dependency would arise, with trustees deciding on payouts, timing, and purposes. Every release would be subject to conditions, and every delay would signal a lack of trust. Psychologically, this would have enormous explosive potential. The symbolism of this arrangement is hard to miss. A grown man who has consciously distanced himself from his family would be placed back under their financial control. Observers interpret this move as a subtle but effective demonstration of power, not through open confrontation, but through administrative control. The message is clear. Separation from the institution does not automatically grant access to its resources. This development reinforces the perception of a strategic escalation. Prince William is not acting impulsively, but with a long-term perspective. The financial constraints would not immediately ruin Prince Harry, but would permanently restrict him. The effects would unfold over time. Ongoing costs, increasing financial pressure, and limited room for maneuver could create a situation where alternative sources of income become a necessity. This is precisely where the political dynamite lies. Critics warn that such an arrangement could indirectly pressure Prince Harry to disclose further private details to generate income. What is intended to protect his legacy could thus paradoxically have the opposite effect. The dynamic between control and reaction threatens to escalate further. At the same time, this scenario underscores how far the conflict has strayed from its emotional origins. It is no longer about reconciliation or misunderstandings, but about structural power. The financial straitjacket becomes the symbol of a system that protects its resources and sanctions deviant behavior. Prince Harry is thus faced with a choice that leaves little room for maneuver. The question of whether this measure will actually be implemented remains open, but its mere existence as an option alters the balance of power. It shows that the conflict is not aimed at quick solutions, but at long-term control. Will this strategy force Prince Harry to adapt or deepen the rift completely? It is precisely at this point that the decision will be made whether the power struggle escalates further or enters a new, even more rigid phase. As the legal and structural scenarios intensify, the financial reality moves to the forefront, painting an increasingly tense picture. Behind the scenes, the pressure on Prince Harry and Meghan Markle is noticeably mounting. The high cost of living in California, ongoing financial obligations, and substantial security requirements create a situation where liquidity becomes the decisive factor. This is precisely where the potential blocking of the inheritance has its full impact. Observers point out that the couple's income structure has changed significantly in recent months. Major projects, once considered financial safeguards, are under review or losing momentum. At the same time, expenses remain consistently high or continue to rise. Without the anticipated influx from Princess Diana's estate, this imbalance is exacerbated. The inheritance was not only symbolically significant but also intended as a strategic safety net. This situation intensifies the perception of an existential threat. Prince Harry faces not only family resistance but also the reality of an increasingly precarious business model. The blocking or delaying of the assets acts as a catalyst, accelerating all existing tensions. What was previously theoretical suddenly becomes concrete. During this phase, efforts to explore alternative avenues apparently intensify. Contacts within the Spencer family gain importance. The hope of finding support or at least understanding is palpable. At the same time, there is growing concern that any external escalation will further increase the pressure. The room for maneuver is visibly narrowing. Prince William, on the other hand, seems prepared to withstand this pressure. His strategy is designed to buy time. A frozen fortune doesn't take effect immediately, but gradually. The longer the blockade lasts, the greater the pressure on Prince Harry to adapt. This asymmetry is part of the balance of power. The future king has institutional stability, while his brother depends on a continuous income. Public perception remains a double-edged sword. On the one hand, Prince Harry could generate sympathy by portraying himself as the victim of a cold power strategy. On the other hand, there is a risk that any further public escalation will validate Prince William's arguments. The accusation that the legacy is being exploited would be further fueled. Thus, the circle is complete. The conflict, which once began as a personal rift, culminates in a financial and structural dispute with an uncertain outcome. The central question is no longer who is morally right, but who has the greater staying power. Can Prince Harry withstand the pressure without burning any more bridges? Or will the blocking of the inheritance become a turning point that fundamentally changes his strategy? The conclusion is bitter. The dispute over Princess Diana's legacy is more than a family conflict. It is a lesson in power, control, and the consequences of a public split. The coming months will show whether this escalation leads to a restructuring of the relationship or seals the final break. One question remains open and is directed at the public. Is this a necessary protection of a historical legacy or a show of power that further fuels the conflict? The escalating conflict between Prince William and Prince Harry has reached a dimension that goes far beyond personal estrangement. At its core is no longer just wounded pride or public criticism, but a strategic power struggle for control and the legacy of Princess Diana. What was considered a secure inheritance for years has now become a contested resource, the release or blocking of which has far-reaching consequences. The development reveals a clear pattern. Prince William is apparently pursuing a long-term strategy aimed at safeguarding his assets and ensuring institutional stability. Concern about legal risks abroad, particularly under the Californian legal system, serves as the driving force. The assets are to remain within the British sphere of influence to protect them from unforeseen developments. In this context, a financial block appears not as a punishment, but as a preventative measure. For Prince Harry, however, this strategy represents a fundamental shift. The financial independence he associated with his mother's inheritance is now at risk. Simultaneously, economic pressure is mounting due to high running costs and uncertain income streams. The potential blocking of his assets acts as a catalyst, accelerating existing tensions and further restricting his options. The Spencer family, especially Earl Spencer and the L. Torb administration, plays a key role. Their decision is perceived not only as a familial act, but also as a symbolic one. Loyalty, responsibility, and political significance clash directly here. Every choice has the potential to either diffuse the conflict or exacerbate it. Ultimately, this dispute reveals a fundamental dilemma. How can a historically and emotionally charged legacy be protected without creating new divisions? The conflict surrounding Princess Diana's legacy exemplifies the tensions between individual freedom and institutional control. Whether this power struggle leads to a reorganization or definitively cements the rift remains open, as does the question of whether protection or a demonstration of power is the true motive.